Thanks so much for joining us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the Lsat blog, and I also host the Lsat Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And I'm joined tonight by Laura. Laura, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Laura Hosed, and I do private law school and college admissions counseling work. And I've worked in many law schools and attended law school and all that fun stuff.
Awesome. And you were at Georgetown, right?
I was at Georgetown for many years in the Office of Career Services in the law school, so helping law students with their career plans. And then I also worked on Georgetown's undergrad campus as the pre-law advisor.
Awesome. Fantastic. I'm sure a lot of folks will have a lot of questions about that. But I figured since the January LSAT was today, folks just got out a couple hours ago, depending on your time zone, I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit around cancellations and retakes. And Laura, feel free to share your thoughts on this. But my general recommendation with regard to the cancellations side of things is that it typically isn't worth canceling, since law schools don't average multiple scores. They only take the highest.
I completely agree. It's risky. And even if you feel like you didn't do well, usually you did better than you thought. And, it's helpful to see the score before you evaluate whether to retake it and what you're aiming for.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you can't really point to anything specific that went horribly astronomically wrong, then that vague sense of unease, as you're saying, it's like totally normal. It's to be expected.
Yeah.
And
yeah, if you had the flu, it's another story. If something dramatic happened, but that's rarely the case. Usually it's just some sense of like, I didn't do as well as I thought because of nerves or whatever, in which case I agree. Canceling is usually not worthwhile.
Exactly. And if you are thinking about canceling, you don't need to do it in the heat of the moment. You don't need to do it on the day of. You've got 6 calendar days to make that decision, and there's not really any advantage to doing it sooner rather than later, as long as you're not going to forget.
Yes, I get a lot of panicked calls right afterwards, and then once students have a few days to calm down and think it over, they rarely end up canceling.
Yeah. And then we have the question of retaking and when to retake, whether to retake. And my sense is that the January LSAT is kind of the last point in the cycle at which you'd want to take it and still apply during this cycle. What do you think about that, Laura, in terms of what's too late?
I would agree. Most of you probably know that law school admissions are rolling. So students begin applying in as early as September, and law schools start admitting students throughout the fall and into the winter and spring. And so even though, deadlines may be in March, it's really to your advantage to apply earlier. So you're still fine to take it in January and have everything ready to go. But waiting until the absolute last minute is usually not a great idea. A lot of spots have been given out, a lot of scholarship money has been given out, and you may want to consider, depending on your situation, waiting to apply next cycle when you can apply with the score that you are happy with and apply right at the beginning of the cycle.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I think that if you're taking in February, March, it's starting to get pretty late. You might as well just take it if that's the best time to take it, but then apply at the very beginning of the cycle in the fall.
Right, because your scores are good for 5 years, correct?
Yes.
So many students, when I was working on the undergrad campus, a lot of students who knew that they were going to take a year or two or more off would still take the LSAT in, the spring of their senior year while they're still in student mode and have the time to focus on it, but they knew they weren't going to be applying that cycle.
Exactly. So I'll tell folks a lot of times, you could study over winter break, take it in January, you could study over the summer, and take it at the very beginning of the fall.
Yeah. I think if you're looking ahead and trying to figure out when to take it, you want to kind of work backwards and figure out when you're going to have the time to devote to studying for it, because ideally you only have to take it once.
Exactly. And since scores are good for 5 years, there's really no reason to prioritize 1 month over another. From an admissions perspective, just take it whenever is right for you. And so folks who took January today and are thinking about retaking, I'd say, yeah, while you're still in LSAT mode, you only got to stay fresh on the LSAT for another month or so and to take it in February, but you may not necessarily want to apply this cycle with the February score. And nobody ever wants to hear this, but as we said, delaying is probably the best course of action.
Yeah, and in many cases, it can be advantageous for a lot of reasons. If you are still in school and your grades have been on an upward trend or have been rocky or even have been good, delaying allows you to apply with an additional semester worth of grades, because then you will have your second semester senior year grades as part of your application. It also gives you a chance to do something interesting that you add to your resume and makes you more appealing to law schools. I think there's definitely been a trend in recent years for law schools to want to see some experience between undergrad and law school, or if you're already out of school, an additional year often can only help because you'll have increased responsibilities, potentially better recommendation letters, and just more interesting experience to write about.
That's a great point. I really like the idea of giving yourself another semester to get higher grades and to show that upward trend. Because I hear from a lot of students also who they're really worried about freshman year grades being unusually low for them, and maybe they were partying too much or having difficulty adjusting, and it takes a little bit of time, but the numbers are the numbers. They're still going to be on there. They're still going to affect that GPA average in the end. But giving yourself fall semester senior year to load those grades into the transcript and then apply in the fall, I think definitely would help give a bit of a boost.
Yeah, and I also find that a lot of times, by senior year, you're taking these more advanced, smaller seminar classes, depending on your major, depending on what school you're at. And, you might have the opportunity to develop the kind of relationship with a professor by writing a thesis or just being in one of these small classes that will lend itself to a really strong recommendation letter that might have been tougher if you were trying to do this a little bit earlier.
That's a great point as well. Definitely getting a better rec letter. And also by senior year, even if the classes are more advanced, you've also got your study skills a bit more figured out, got the routine more figured out. And so I think grades are likely to be higher just because you're going to be taking it more seriously as well.
Yeah. And classes, ideally it's your major and it's something you're excited about and passionate about and often do better in.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about recommendation letters for a moment, just because you were talking about that. So folks taking a fall semester senior level seminar, for example, or spring semester senior level seminar, aside from professors, who else might they ask for those rec letters?
Well, you're definitely going to want to have at least one professor, solid academic letter who can talk about the type of student you are and what you're going to be like in the classroom in law school. And so whether that's someone who can really, comment on your participation or your writing, or you've gone to them and, talked to them during office hours. And so they can just sort of talk about how you analyze and think. Those are all things that are going to be valuable in the law school classroom. As far as an additional letter, there are a lot of options. It could be someone who has supervised you in an internship or a summer job or, any kind of position, who can talk about you in a different context and, what you're going to be like as a lawyer and in the working world. They don't have to have any knowledge of the law or the legal profession, but it's more like, what kind of professional are you going to be? It could be someone who you've worked closely with in some sort of club or extracurricular activity and who, really just knows the kind of responsibilities that you take on, the kind of leadership qualities you possess, that kind of thing. And those are the most typical. Sometimes you'll see a coach or something like that. I mean, just really someone who knows you well and can write a letter that will explain why they want to have you in their law school class.
That's a great point. Definitely someone who knows you well, not someone famous, not someone who has a more impressive title or a more impressive name, but just whoever can speak most specifically to you. So rather than a member of Congress, it would be perhaps their chief of staff or your direct supervisor in that role.
Absolutely. I mean, if you happen to know someone famous really well, great. But in most cases, when I get this question, it's always the less impressive person who knows you better. Because law schools they don't want to see a generic letter from someone impressive. It's not going to get you very far.
Of course. Now, how does this change for non-traditional students? We got a question here in the chat about that. Who might they get recommendations from, or is it simply they have more work experience options? Do they still need a professor in that situation?
I mean, usually they're still going to want to see one academic letter, which can be difficult if you've been out of school for a while. But I think that professors are also kind of used to being contacted by people who have been out of school for a while and all of a sudden realize they need a letter. So even if that's not going to be your strongest letter. There are things you can do. You can offer to meet with the professor, or, if you're not local anymore, talk to them by Zoom, remind them about what you did in the class. Obviously, this is tougher the longer you've been out of law school. Maybe if there's any sort of classes that you've taken, it doesn't have to be as part of your undergraduate degree, but anyone who knows you in an academic context. That being said, the much more important letters at that point, if you've been out of school for a while, are going to be from your employers. And that also gets kind of tricky because sometimes you don't want your current employer to know that you're applying to law school. And in that case, it's often a little bit of, sort of trying to figure out if there's anyone where you feel comfortable confiding in them, and they'll also be able to write a good letter. But you might want to have multiple letters if you're really involved in some sort of volunteer activity or, any sort of organization outside of your professional workplace. That can work also.
Awesome. All great advice. I have nothing to add to that. Really covered it well. Got a ton of questions here in the chat. What about the resume for non-traditional students, and how are they looked at overall? Are they looked at differently than students who are younger and coming directly out of college?
I think they are. I think it's, it's usually viewed as a positive. I think even if the work experience isn't related to the law, that's fine too. I think in law schools, and later on, I really saw this when I was working in career services, employers really value law students who have some time off between undergrad and college because it shows a certain maturity and professionalism. And also, I think there's a sense that if you have taken all this time off and are going back to law school, you have really thought this decision through, are doing it for, the right reasons, hopefully, and really want to be a lawyer, as opposed to, not to stereotype, but I went straight from undergrad to law school and I didn't really have a good reason for wanting to go. And so I think there are ways to overcome that. If you are coming straight from undergrad and you do really want to go to law school, there's ways to show that in the personal statement. But I think that you have somewhat of an advantage having some experience. Now, if you've been out of school a really long time, that can sometimes be a little trickier, but it's really the personal statement where you're able to tell them all of the reasons why you're applying to law school at this point and how you think your background is going to enable you to make some strong contributions to the classroom and to the legal field.
Love it. And we've got one comment here from Yumira saying that she runs her own business, and that's what she's been doing as a non-traditional student. I would imagine that might even hold some particular weight, that law schools would love to see that. Absolutely.
If, especially if you can relate that to, the skills that you have developed by running your own business, that are going to be transferable to the legal profession. Whether or not you want to practice any sort of law that has anything to do with what you're doing now, I think there are just a lot of really good transferable skills that you've developed.
Definitely. Now, for someone who's at this point in the application cycle, kind of smack in the middle, they're pulling everything together. Is there anything they can do in those final moments before hitting submit to beef up their application?
I think, really, having multiple people read your personal statement. I mean, not too many, but, really making sure that your voice comes through and that it makes a compelling point. Anytime there's any sort of optional essay or piece of the application, you should do it. I always say it is not optional if you want to go to that school. So additional essays are a pain, but you should do them. I think anytime you can personalize your application to the particular school. So sometimes you'll see if there's not a sort of why this school essay, sometimes people will alter the last paragraph of their personal statement to add some particular information about why they specifically are interested, not just in law school, but in this school. So I think that's a good way to demonstrate interest because law schools are trying to figure out who is actually likely to enroll. So anything you can do to show them that you're interested both in law school and in their particular school, I think is valuable.
Definitely. And making use of all the different parts of the application, all the different essays, which actually reminds me, I was speaking with a student earlier today about character and fitness issues. The student had struggled with addiction. He had 4 different misdemeanors related to the addiction. And he was going to talk about this in the character and fitness portion, of course, as required. And he also wanted to cover it in his main personal statement. And I was hesitant to go along with this because I was thinking, you don't want to make this the entire theme of the application. But he was really confident. He had a compelling statement on this topic, talking about how he would go around and speak at different hospitals to current addicts who were struggling when he himself had overcome the addiction, and then would maybe use an optional essay to talk about a different angle of himself altogether. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, my initial instinct would be exactly what you said. You're covering that in the character and fitness. Why would you want that to be the only thing that they know about you and the only, the thing to focus on? Also, it's just kind of a waste to repeat anything in multiple places. Like, you want to use every opportunity to give them new and additional information that'll make you stand out. So I don't know. I could see, depending on the angle he took with the speaking, where maybe that could work. But my, default answer would be no, just address that in character and fitness and use the opportunity to highlight some other positive aspect of your application.
Yeah, my thought is that if typically, on average, if you have 2 potential essays or 3 potential essays, pick totally different areas of your resume, your experiences, or whatever you want, and go deeper on them rather than trying to list it all in one big essay.
Absolutely. It's this is the same thing as undergrad. They're reading a lot of essays. And so you want to make it interesting. You want to try to stand out. You don't want it to just rehash your resume. They have your resume. You don't want to be redundant. That it's kind of a waste to repeat the same topic in the diversity essay and the personal statement, let's say. You might as well come up with something different to talk about if you can.
Yeah. We've got more questions from non-traditional students. Lots of non-traditional students in the house tonight asking, what's the most effective statement topics for non-traditional students in particular? Are there any special concerns or things they should be thinking about when writing their statements?
I think, again, just really making clear why you have made this decision to pursue law school at this point in your life and career, and how your current or former experience will be relevant, how it's motivated you, how it's made you a good candidate, and the perspective that you're going to bring to the law school classroom is really valuable. Even if, like I said, if your work experience has nothing to do with the law, you're still going to be in that 1L classroom bringing, the same way an international student brings a diverse perspective. Someone who's had 10 years working in, the engineering field brings a different perspective to contracts and tort law than someone who's come straight from undergrad. So
certainly, yeah, really focusing on the work experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, shift direction a little bit. We got a question on the GRE, which always comes up.
Yeah.
Applying with a GRE score as opposed to an Lsat score. I'll touch on this briefly. I've gotten the impression from a number of admission officers that it's really a small percentage, like less than 5% of applicants with GRE scores. And unless you have something truly unique about your background that warrants applying with a GRE, like maybe more of a STEM background, let's say, the LSAT score is typically the way to go. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I always encourage students to give the LSAT a try. I think, no matter what law schools are saying publicly, I think from what I hear, they still really prefer the LSAT. I think there are some cases, like I just talked to a student who already has a GRE score because she had thought about master's programs in the past. So in her case, she's still going to take the LSAT, but she has that as a backup if the LSAT doesn't go as well as she'd like. Sometimes if you're really struggling with the LSAT, I could see maybe switching to the GRE, but in most cases, I always recommend to stick with the LSAT.
Yeah. One thing I do want to point out, though, about the LSAT is that if you have an official LSAT score on file, then law schools are obligated to report that to the ABA, and therefore they're obligated to take it seriously because it will affect their standing in the rankings.
Yes, the rankings. So it's, and so maybe if you're just really struggling with it in practice and you realize that you're not going to get the score that you want. But like I said, I haven't really had anybody apply with the GRE.
Yeah, probably not worth going that route. And also, law schools want to know that you're serious about law school specifically and that you have what it takes to do well in law school. And the LSAT has a much stronger demonstrated association with first-year law school grades.
There's also just no data really. I'll have students ask me like, what is a good GRE score for Georgetown law? Well, I have no idea because there's so few people have applied with the GRE score that I think law schools are really doing it for a very, very small population where it might make sense for them. But I would stick with the LSAT.
Yeah. One last comment I want to make on that is that the percentiles may not be applicable the same way. So a 95th percentile GRE is not the same as 95th percentile LSAT score. The LSAT score is taken far more seriously because it's more difficult. The pool of competition with the GRE is much broader, and as a result, it's not as fierce competition. So it's easier to do well on the GRE, and law schools know that. All right, so once again, back to the non-traditional students with regard to the resume. How long should the resume be, and how far back should it go?
That's a tough one. I like one-page resumes, but I think if you have been out of school for a while, it's okay to have a second page. I think if you're going to go on to a second page, you want to have at least it's strange to have a page and like a quarter. So only go on to the second page if you really have enough substance to have close to a full second page. I like breaking it up into sections. So you really highlight what's most important and most recent and most relevant right up front. And then if you have other experience that you want to list, almost, having it in another section so that it's not as prominent, but it's there. Also, I think, LinkedIn profiles are a good way to sort of be able to include a lot of past history if you have a lot of jobs and it's going to be really clunky on a resume. But I think any professional work should be on there. I don't think you want to leave any big time gaps because it just leads the admissions committee to wonder what you were doing. So I think you want to account for all of the years since you graduated undergrad.
Okay, 2 follow-ups on this. One of them is I'm assuming that the student could put the LinkedIn profile at the top of the resume along with their address and name and all that, like just a quick short link to it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is to get more granular for a moment. Can you share some examples of what warrants pushing the resume above one page and what isn't really significant enough to justify that?
Well, I think if you feel like you cannot include all of your professional experience since undergrad without going onto a second page, then I think that's absolutely necessary. I think if you are in a quote unquote real job right now, you really need to be able to go into significant detail to explain what you're doing, particularly if it's not, there's some jobs where everyone kind of understands what the basic duties are. But if you're doing something that's in a niche area or you really feel like you need to give more explanation, that's going to take more space. I think taking off, and this is probably less relevant for non-traditional candidates and more for students coming straight from undergrad, high school can go. There's really no reason to be listing your high school activities anymore, unless it's something that's really, you had national recognition for something, or you went to a very prestigious school that you want to at least list the name of, or if you're trying to show a tie to a geographic area. But, for the most part, nobody really needs to know that you were in the debate club, your sophomore year of high school, or that you ran track. So that stuff can all go. Sometimes, older internships or summer jobs, if they're not relevant, sometimes I'll have students or clients just list them, sort of like relevant experience with some detail about the more professional things. And then a smaller section that just lists, other experience and just kind of list things with a date and no explanation. Like, we know what a waitress does. I think things like that are important to have on the resume because I think everybody knows that it's a really demanding job and it shows people skills. And, anyone who has worked in the restaurant industry understands what a commitment it is. At the same time, there's no need to go into detail about it. And so you can just list it.
Right. Okay. So we know that the obviously professional work experience definitely goes on the resume. What about other softer things like travel, hobbies, languages? Is that stuff filler or is it worth including?
I think it depends. I think languages, if you are truly fluent in a language, that should go on there. If you, just studied Spanish in college, I don't know that that's necessary unless, you also can have multiple resumes for multiple purposes. So if later down the line you're applying to an internship where Spanish skills would be relevant, well, then stick it back on there. But, for just basic law school purposes, I think unless you're fluent in a language, it doesn't really need to be on there. travel, hobbies, again, it depends on the purpose. And for interviews, I always like to put them on there because I think it's a conversation starter. If you get somebody else who runs marathons, then they're going to remember you and you're going to start talking about that. Of course, if you just put, I like to read on there, that doesn't really do anybody any good. So I think if you have specific hobbies like, reading Russian literature, you can put it on there. But if they're just kind of vague, like I like watching basketball, I don't think that serves much of a purpose. And same thing with the languages. If you are fluent, if taken something at a high level, I think it's worth including. With computer skills, I think, nobody needs to list that they know how to use Microsoft Word. I take that off resumes all the time. Like, I think it's just assumed you know how to use Google, you know how to use Microsoft Excel. If you're really advanced in Microsoft Excel, then maybe put that on there. But, just general computer skills I don't think are necessary. And sometimes it makes more sense to incorporate them into the description of the job where you use them. So, used SPSS or whatever computer program you're talking about to do X, Y, Z. And then you don't need to have a separate section.
And on the note about the computer skills, I'd imagine that including certifications from online courses or online programs that are more formal in nature, that crosses the threshold of being worthwhile to include because it has an official stamp on it of some sort.
Absolutely. I think, and it also just shows that you're the kind of person who takes the initiative to do something like that. So I think those are definitely useful to include.
Right. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the diversity statement. Got a few questions on that. Diversity statements, should all underrepresented minorities write one? And then should other folks write them as well? Like, is being a non-traditional student sufficient? Or things like being LGBTQ or something else?
I would always write one if you can. I think, like I said before, the more information you can give them, the better. So if you are an underrepresented minority, I would absolutely write it, unless you feel like it has just absolutely no bearing and doesn't impact your perspective at all. But I think in most cases, there is something to write about. The tougher problem is if you are not an underrepresented minority, if you're not LGBTQ, if you are not a non-traditional student and you just, are struggling for something to write about, I think, you don't want to push it and make it something that is going to do more harm than good. But I have seen some really creative ones. Again, think about what the law school is looking for. They're looking for the perspective that you are going to bring to the 1L classroom. So if there's something in your background that causes you to view the world differently, I wouldn't necessarily write about being female, but I had a student who wrote a great essay about being a diversity statement about being female because she worked in a completely male-dominated industry. And so it wasn't just that she was female, it was that she was female in a male-dominated industry, and that was great. I had a math major write one just from like an academic standpoint about how, she spent all her time with, math science people, but she has this interest in the law. I had someone write one about how she, grew up moving every couple of years because of family situations. And that was an interesting one also. And so someone who lived abroad for a year was able to make that into anything that you can convincingly, maintain that will give you a different view on the world, I think is worthy of a diversity statement.
Right. And we've got comments in the chat about this asking, is being a military spouse worth writing a diversity statement on, or if you have a learning disability? And what I'm getting from you is that any of these things certainly could. Yeah. It's all about the perspective that you approach it from.
Absolutely. Military spouse, definitely. I mean, I think that you've got to see the world differently, and have had some really interesting experiences. So learning disabilities are a little trickier just because, if it's something that's going to impact your ability to succeed in law school, then you want to tread a little lightly and just make sure you're not raising any red flags.
Yeah, instead, what I might do if I had a learning disability is I would apply for Lsat testing accommodations and then not mention it to LSAC because as a result of a Supreme Court case, they do not disclose that you received accommodations.
Yeah, that was a great change when they stopped doing that.
Yeah, certainly. We've got another question on Daca recipients. What do Daca recipients need to know? How do law schools look at them? Any thoughts there?
That is something that I am not really an expert on. Do you have any thoughts?
I actually don't know too much about it either. All I know is that it unfortunately impacts ability to receive financial aid, which is really sad. Other than that, I don't know too much, but I think that law schools, if you're writing a diversity statement as being an undocumented immigrant, I think that could be a great way to approach it.
Yeah.
See, so many great questions here. Let's see, what haven't we hit yet? Yeah. What about international students? Should they write diversity statements? Yeah. And what else should they include in their application?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, same comments. International students, whether you however much time you've spent living abroad, or, having family abroad, it's all interesting stuff that's going to make you have things to contribute that are different than your average person who, grew up in Baltimore like I did. So I think it's interesting and worth including.
Yeah.
I think it's also going to be important to, I'm not sure what we mean by international, but if it's someone who's, really like fully international and has never lived here, then you're obviously going to need to explain in the personal statement why you're looking to study law in the U.S.
Yeah, you want them to know that you have career goals that require a JD and that you're going to be gainfully employed 9 months after graduation.
Right. And even just, that you're going, it's very, with undergrad, there's sort of this, everybody's going for the most part to college somewhere if they've applied to college. But for law school, there are plenty of people who apply and don't go anywhere. So you really need to, and there are plenty of people who start and don't finish law school. So you really want to convince them that you are planning to go to law school and finish law school.
Definitely. We did a question about someone, a non-traditional student, concerned that they haven't had jobs related to the legal field and that it might be a red flag for admissions, and that they were also unemployed for a bit, but kept themselves busy with productive activities. And my take on this is that totally fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I really don't think, when I worked in the law school in the career services office at Georgetown, I worked with a lot of the evening students. They have a part-time division. And so the majority of my students in that section had work experience between undergraduate and law school, and many of them were working while going to law school, which is amazing. And I don't know how they did it. But I was, really impressed by the wide variety of things people had done. And most of them hadn't been doing things in the legal field. People were doing all kinds of different things. And the ones that had different backgrounds before law school were some of the most sought after by employers, because they had, sort of a combination of two different types of experiences.
Yeah, certainly that intersection could be really powerful.
Yeah. And as far as the gap on the resume, I mean, that's, so many people have gaps on their resume. I think if you were doing productive things during that time, I think thinking about how to convey that, whether on the resume or in the personal statement, so they see what you were doing, and they don't necessarily care whether you were being paid or not. They just want to see how you were spending your time and what you were gaining from the experiences.
I would imagine that they don't necessarily need to see legal experience, because there aren't that many easy ways to get it before you're a lawyer, other than maybe being a paralegal. But they want to see some exposure to the law in some way. It's nice to have.
Yeah, I think it's nice to have, in the sense that they want to know that you understand what you're getting into and why you're going to law school, and have enough information to make an informed decision. But I don't think it's necessary at all that you have legal experience. And I get a lot of that from students when I meet with them early on in college, and they want to do like legal internships over the summer because they know they want to go to law school. And I tell them, great if you want to, but you really don't have to. You do what you want to do over the summer, as long as you're employed and doing something that is productive. But it does not have to be a legal job. I don't think law schools are looking for that necessarily at all.
No, and I tell folks all the time, they're asking me, should I do X, Y, Z activity to get into law school? And I tell them, don't do anything just to get into law school, especially because with regard to the parts of the application, the numbers really are the biggest impact. Study for the Lsat, keep your GPA up. But aside from that, your work is whatever it is, your volunteer work is whatever that is, and then you just work on putting together the best essays possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's less holistic than undergrad. They want the GPA and they want the Lsat score.
Certainly.
And the other things, especially for the elite schools who can fill their classes many times over with people who have the Lsat score in the grades, that's when all those other things come into play. But at the, you got to clear that bar first and foremost.
Certainly. We got a question related to the GPA about how law schools look at having a master's degree. Do they care? Is it a benefit, especially if it's in a STEM field like engineering?
Engineering is great. Employers love law students who have technical skills. We couldn't even, at Georgetown, we could not even fill all the interview spots that the employers wanted people with technical backgrounds who also were in law school. So I think that's a really big asset. But master's degrees in general, I think, are great. They're not going to necessarily help mitigate a poor academic performance in undergrad, but they serve the same purpose as any other experience. They demonstrate a commitment and an interest to a particular field. They just give you something over someone who's coming straight from undergrad, and that you have some other experience. And it's another opportunity for you to prove that you're able to be a strong student and develop relationships with professors, and it's all part of your narrative and your argument as to why you're interested in law school.
Right. Definitely. They love the engineers. They love anyone who's succeeded well in higher education and gotten further degrees. But my understanding is that while they will see the transcripts from the master's programs, those are not calculated in the LSAC GPA.
Correct. Right. So that's where I said it will not mitigate poor performance because it'll certainly help if you can show strong grades, but it's that undergrad GPA that they're reporting to US News.
That's crazy. Why is that exactly?
I don't have a good answer for that. I think master's programs just probably vary so much in quality, and they're just not able to assess the value of them and the rigor. I really don't know.
That seems reasonable enough. I'd imagine that someone who's continued in liberal arts all along undergrad and then master's level, with the grade inflation on the liberal side, that could certainly help them. And then someone who's doing the engineering after engineering after engineering, a B+ could be amazing, but it's not going to stack up against the A's from the other side.
Right. And I don't think the law school admissions people have the bandwidth to, be evaluating the, tons and tons of master's programs that are out there. Whereas with the undergrad programs, they do, have a good sense of how they compare.
Right. And if you're willing, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the career services side of things, since you worked in Georgetown's office there. For folks who are applying to law school now, who are really thinking ahead about career options after graduating law school, is there anything they should be thinking about in the present moment?
Yeah, I think they should, and this is what I preach to all of my clients and students, is to really give some thought as to why are you going to law school? What are you going to do with this degree? And part of this is helping people not make the mistakes that I may have made. But I think for the application process, it's important to consider where geographically you might want to practice. If you are one of those people who is looking at the top schools, you can go to Harvard and practice anywhere in the country, not a problem. But if you're looking at, sort of a different level of school, I think the alumni networks tend to be really strong in the city where that school is located. And sometimes it might make sense to go to a lower ranked school in the city you plan to practice in versus potentially a slightly higher ranked school in another city. Because I think some law schools are very regional, and you can get a great education and get a great job. But if you go to the other side of the country, that school may not have as much value and may not be as well known. Employers certainly aren't going to be coming to recruit across the country at a school that they don't get a lot of students from. So it just makes it more difficult for you. So taking that into consideration. And then other than that, I think there are some schools that are better for some things. It's not like undergrad where you have a major, but if you're really passionate about doing a particular type of public interest work, looking at the different journals and clinics that a school offers, looking at whether you'll be able to do internships during the year. That was one really big advantage that Georgetown students had, is that they could do all kinds of internships in DC during the school year when they were less competitive, and also students that, I won't name any particular school, but some schools are not in major metropolitan areas, and it's not as easy to intern during the year. So that's one advantage. Other things to think about are really, if you know that you want to have a career in the public sector, you may want to think about looking for schools that will offer you merit money, where you can graduate with less debt, and that'll give you more flexibility. Because if you take on a lot of debt for law school, especially if you're at a top law school, and there are a lot of law firms recruiting there, it's going to become really tempting to go to a firm where you can make a lot of money and may not be exactly what you want to do. You just have more freedom and flexibility if you have less debt. There's also some of the top schools have loan repayment assistance programs if you are going to be working in the public interest. So really evaluating what they have to offer and what the requirements are can be a factor. And if you are, if you do want to go the big firm route, looking at which law firms recruit on the particular campuses. And that should be information that is pretty easy to get from the career services offices. And if they don't want to share that with you, then that's usually not a great sign. So, try to find out how many employers are interviewing on campus and how many people they're hiring.
So many great nuggets there, Laura. I'm really glad you raised all these issues around law school selection, because I have folks come to me, they'll say, I have this GPA, I think I'm going to get this LSAT score. Where should I apply? What are some good schools for me? And I think that's the totally backwards way to approach it. Instead, I would look by geography, look by region you want to practice in, find the best ranked schools in that area, see what LSAT scores you need, and go from there. But as you said, also look into things like the employment rates and bar passage rates and things of that nature. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to the website Law School Transparency, because they do a great job pulling all that data from the 509 reports, which are reports submitted to the American Bar Association on all of these important employment and bar passage related factors. And they really distill it in very easy to understand reports and graphs for every single law school in the country.
Yeah, I remember when that website started. That guy was not very popular.
No.
But I'd also remember to take all statistics and numbers with a grain of salt, because everything can be somewhat manipulated.
For sure. One particular thing to look at with those reports is the jobs requiring a JD. I like how they separate it out, because being employed at McDonald's after law school is not the same thing as being employed at a top law firm.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of controversy when people started paying attention to these numbers. A lot of law schools would hire their own grads in all kinds of positions just to count them as employed.
Yeah, that's crazy. I remember that as well. And the guy who started Law School Transparency, I mean, he's been a thorn in their side, but he's stuck around. For at least 10 years, I think. Incredible.
Yeah, it was a while ago, because I was still at Georgetown when that started.
So we've got a follow-up here related to the law school selection process, which is how to best research different programs that different schools offer and which programs are best.
Yeah, I think all of the traditional ways that you would think of, reading on, there's tons of information available online, but I think talking to students who have been through the process, talking to attorneys in that area who have a sense of, where other attorneys that they respect have come from and, where they went, and just hearing different people's experiences, going to visit the schools, sitting in on a class, talking to a professor, that all, obviously it's more difficult if you're out of town, but those are all things that you can consider doing to gain more information. But at the end of the day, it's so hard, because I do undergrad consulting as well. And I say the exact opposite for that. That's all about finding the right fit and where you're going to be. Law school, I would, ranked school, taking into consideration things like geography and finances. You just want to go to really the best school you can get into to put yourself in the best position for the job market.
Yeah, it's kind of funny actually, because folks will change their desired practice area potentially a couple of times before graduating. And then a lot of firms and other employers, they want to see the name on the resume of the law school. And that has more impact than a certain program.
Oh, it really does. And, law firms in particular, I think because you don't really major in anything, you can take any classes you want. Your practice area ends up sometimes being random. You get to a firm and that's what they're busy in the bankruptcy department and that's what you end up doing. Or it becomes very deliberate based on your internships over the summer. You want to do criminal law and you pick a path and those are the internships you do. And so the law school, I don't think is that important. You can practice any kind of law coming from any law school.
Yeah. In fact, you'll still spend months preparing for the bar exam afterwards anyway.
Right. Exactly.
We've got a question here related to careers. Part-time law graduates, are they viewed differently by employers than others?
I think they are in both positive and negative ways. I think, first of all, their employers are very, very impressed by people who are able to work and go to school part-time and still do really well. And you bring a lot to the table, similar to, anybody who has experience between undergrad and law school. Whatever you're doing during the rest of the time, I think is an asset and is something you can sell. And again, it's the professionalism, the professional contacts that you have at that point. The negatives that I found were just that those law students were not necessarily able to participate in a lot of the things that full-time students could participate in, just purely because they didn't have time to be doing a journal or a clinic because they were working during the day. And so you could also be a part-time student and not be working, and that could be a different story. And then it just all depends on what you're doing with your time. But I think, one of the tough things about the part-time schedule is not necessarily being able to participate in everything. But I know schools like Georgetown made a really big effort to make things available to evening students as well. And, the Career Services Office was always open one night a week late for evening students. And we would always hold programs, we would do it during the day and at night. So, if that's something that you're concerned about, I would really look into what opportunities the part-time students have at the particular school and make sure that they're on par with the full-time students.
And maybe even talk to some current part-time students to see what their experiences are like.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, so we got a few questions that have come in related to the LSAT that I'll knock out before we wrap up here.
Yeah.
See, Abigail's asking, can you score a 160 on the LSAT if you've never taken it before? I suppose it's possible. I mean, I would do a diagnostic to see what that's like if you want, but I wouldn't do that on the actual thing. There's no reason to take the LSAT just to see how you'll do, at least not in official test administration, because that will be on your score report. And while law schools do not average multiple scores and only take the highest, still, you don't want to have a score that does not reflect your true potential on your record if you can at all avoid it. But take a diagnostic if you like, but also remember that that does not reflect your potential. It's simply a starting point and tells you what you already know, which is that you haven't studied the LSAT yet. Got a question on the digital LSAT. How does it compare to paper? There's pros and cons. I mean, I think that one pro is the countdown timer is built into it, so there's no ambiguity or proctor error around timing. Downsides, though, include potential tech issues and glitches, which have happened on every digital LSAT administration somewhere in the country. And while I wouldn't expect it, I would still be prepared for it. I've taught many classes on the digital LSAT, and I would refer you to those on the YouTube channel if you want more details, where I've done walkthroughs of all the various features there. And with regard to scratch paper, yes, you do get a booklet of scratch paper of about 12 to 14 pages, 8.5 by 11 unlined, which is not unlimited, but it's certainly more than enough. All right, I think that's about all the questions in the chat. Before we wrap up, any last words of wisdom you want to share with everyone, Laura?
I don't think so. I think just, being very thoughtful about why you're looking to go to law school and the timing of when you're applying, and making sure to fully prepare for the LSAT, because, it is what it is, but the numbers are what are driving the admissions decision. So every extra bit of time you put into making sure that you have strong grades and a strong score will just open more doors and give you more options.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. And Laura, you want to share the best way for folks to reach you?
Sure. You can find my website is just my full name, Laura Hosid, LauraHosid.com. You can find my bio and information on there.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining. And folks, have any questions on digital LSAT prep, retaking, feel free to reach out. You can find me through the LSAT blog, as well as the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. Laura, thanks for joining. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.